Well, I was in a bit of a Mark Simonitch game mood after playing Salerno, so I pulled out an oldie of his, an older one, I should say, of his. This is from 2009. This is the Caucasus Campaign, and it's going to play similar in many ways to his Ardennes 44, France 40 kind of system. Now, it's not a ZOC-Bond game per se, but it does employ the concepts of ZOC-Bonds when it comes to retreats. For example, if you have a situation like here. In a ZOC-Bond game, these two hexes here clearly have ZOC-Bonds. You got units stacked in here, units stacked in here. So this hex is just not accessible to a German movement. In this game, you could move in here. ZOCs do not stop you, but it costs 2 movement points extra to leave a zone of control. So to go from here to here would cost the German player 3 of his 6 movement points. Now let's imagine for a second, under some terrible circumstances, this guy ended up in this position here. This is a terrible position. If he's forced to retreat, in some games, you'd be able to retreat here, take a step loss, retreat again here, and be okay because that place is occupied. In this game, that would not be the case, as this unit here would not have a retreat path except into a hex between 2 stacks or a hex side between 2 stacks. So the ZOC-Bond concept, I guess is what I'm trying to say. The ZOC-Bond concept is here, but it's not a ZOC-Bond game. So I'll say that about it. It uses a different sequence of play. Sequence of play starts with an initial phase where you take care of your reinforcements, you roll for weather, you get your replacements in. Then you have a primary impulse. During your primary impulse, all your units can move. They will then engage in combat. Each side gets 1 rail movement during their primary impulse. And after that, you have a secondary impulse. The secondary impulses are staggered. So after the Axis primary, you have a Soviet secondary. During the secondary, the non-mechanized units, they can either move or they can engage in combat. If they move, they can only move 1 hex, 2 if they're using a road, and don't enter zone of control. So secondary impulses also give you a second shot at combat. So you can get a combat phase and another combat phase between your primary and your secondary impulses. Mechanized units get their full movement rating, and they can do mobile assaults using 3 movement points from their capacity, or they can just say it costs me 3 movement points to join and mark him as committing to an assault with infantry, which obviously can't move. They can either move or attack. And you resolve all your combats. So after the secondary impulse for the Soviets, you'll have an impulse for the Axis, and then a supply check phase. Then it rolls around to a Soviet initial phase, Soviet primary, Soviet supply. You do a victory check, and that's your game turn. Sounds like a lot, but this game rolls right along pretty darn quick. First of all, there's not a lot of units in terms of density. I would say similar in terms of play density. It's probably similar to Salerno 43. I think in terms of number of units, maybe a few more units than Salerno has. The map surface is slightly bigger, but you're going to encounter kind of the same thing as Salerno. There's a lot of the map that's not going to be used as much. For example, not much is going to happen in the steppes here until perhaps late in the game. You might have an Axis thrust up that road to try to take a lunge at Astrakhan. It's a long shot, but maybe you make that effort. You're also not going to have a lot of action in the mountain belt here. You will have some action that will take place, especially along the Black Sea coast, but you're not going to have a lot of things happening here. Most of your action's actually going to happen kind of in this green, clearer terrain belt. And so this is a pretty fast-moving game, and it's a pretty tense game. It's, in my experience, pretty darn well balanced, and at first it looks like absolutely impossible for the Axis. How are they ever going to achieve what they need to achieve? 18 victory points, 20 if the Italian mountain units are entering into the game. There's I think a 33% chance that they will do so. But the game's all about combat shifts and managing those combat shifts and making the most of how the sequence of play flows, using that to your best advantage, leveraging your strengths against your opponent's weaknesses. And what you have is actually a pretty tightly balanced game. In this one here, the Axis is doing really well. I think it's been a long time since I played it, but they seem to be doing pretty good. They got 10 points. They'll get another one up here once the Soviet unit, who has been bedeviling the Axis, he's been out of supply for like, I don't know, like 4 turns. He keeps rolling 5s and 6s to stay in supply. So I might just go ahead and send the SS unit up there to finally deal with him and get him out of there, because it's we need all hands on deck down here. Axis got a nice breakthrough near Voroshilovsk. There is a pretty strong stack of Soviet units in Voroshilovsk. However, the flank units collapsed in a pretty spectacular fashion, and now they were forced to move units out of Voroshilovsk to reestablish line of supply. And Maikop has fallen, Novorossiysk, Krasnodar, and there's a pretty strong drive now on Tuapse. I really feel like this is essential. For the Axis to win, they're going to have to take that location. And probably this. I have taken Sukhumi once, but it's hard to do because it's very easy for the Soviets to reinforce it, and you get more opportunities for determined defense in a city versus a town. So unlikely you'll pick it's only worth 1 point, so a lot of effort to get that 1 point. But to get from our 10 points to 18 for the Axis to win the game, they're going to have to pick up 2, 3, 4. I think this one's 5, 6, 7, and then 8 somewhere down in here. I think Voroshilovsk only 1. Yeah, it's only 1. You also got another one out here. So there's becomes lots of options. As the game progresses, there'll become, some options will open up, and you'll have to commit to one of those options. One of the challenges is the Soviets are not as well mobilized. They're not as mobile, I should say, as the Axis. Axis have a lot of mobile units, but those are not as useful on the Black Sea coast drives. So I tend to try to use my mobile units where they're going to be most effective. But towards the end, you're going to probably find yourself throwing mobile units into battles that they're not ideally suited for out of sheer desperation. In many ways, this game, to me, it feels like a microcosm of the entirety of the Russian campaign, even though on the grand scheme of things, it's almost a backwater in the whole Russian campaign. This is actually a very exciting field of study, because you're going to have these spectacular breakthroughs and big victories up here south of Rostov early in the game, but it's like, man, I just got this big victory, but I have a lot more ground to cover, and the further you go, the harder it gets. Just when it looks like you're about to win, more reinforcements show up in the nick of time, and then the weather starts to become a factor. Now, you're not going to run into winter weather per se, because the game only goes up to November. But what you will start bumping into is once you get into turn 6 and onwards, you have to roll the dice, and there will be a 66% chance that nothing changes. But if you roll a 5 or a 6, then it's poor weather, and the result of that is you do not get your secondary impulses. This will make the game go faster, but it's also depriving the Axis of an opportunity for another attack. Another combat phase, if you will. And that can be a big deal as you're getting close to the end and you need every attack that you can get to wear down the defender. The Soviet reinforcements are going to be coming up from the south. Sometimes they're going to come from the Caspian Sea or from the north, south of Stalingrad, but it usually makes more sense to go ahead and bring these guys across the Caspian Sea. They get random reinforcements that are pulled out of a cup. You're going to get 3 of these guys every turn. One always has to go into Tbilisi. Others can show up where there's HQs or major cities like Grozny. So you're going to use these. You'll also have a random event table which will allow you to draw from these special units like Lend-Lease tanks, naval brigades, Turkish front units, the 4th Guards Cavalry Corps, even the the Black Sea Fleet here. I don't know why I said Red Sea. Black Sea Fleet can actually sortie, and these provide combat shifts, advantages in your determined defenses. They can become a big deal for that. They can also allow your naval brigades to do amphibious landings along the Black Sea coast, which forces the Axis player to stay honest and garrison, some of these locations, some of these ports, like this port here. Might want to keep an eye on things, because the last thing you need is all of a sudden the Soviets able to grab a VP location and you don't have mobile units in play to deal with it late in the game. So you are going to have to garrison a few units. Supply is an issue for both sides. Pay attention, if you ever play this game, pay attention, close attention to the rail network, because you can easily find yourself going, oh, I should not have sent my units in that direction. Pay attention to it. It doesn't always follow intuitive routes. Pay attention to what it does. Don't confuse the railroad with the road network. You can find yourself in a world of hurt later on. You got air units for both sides that can provide combat shifts and die roll modifiers, and the Soviet ones start to come into play one at a time starting on turn 4. The Germans have 2 of them, but they also have a really cool one that provides 2 shifts. The 8th Fliegerkorps shows up. It leaves the game on turn 5. It shows up again on turn 10, and you're going to need that guy towards the end. You got Ost battalions that you roll for, and they'll come into play, and they could be useful for garrisoning these backwater areas. So I'm actually going to be rolling for those Ost units this time. Long and the short of it is, because of the random draws, because of the weather rolls and everything, every game of this can show up different. There's multiple paths to victory. And if you can find a copy of this bad boy, I heartily recommend it. How does it compare to Stalingrad 42? I have no idea, because to my shame, I have not even punched out my copy of Stalingrad 42. I'm looking at it on my shelf going, why haven't you punched this out and played it? So that one will probably be hitting the table soon, because I would like to compare the two. Similar systems, but obviously this one, it does have some differences. Rules weight. Let me say this about it in conclusion. What you have here, this is an older GMT book. It is not full color. It's like got some color in it, I guess you could say, but it's not full color. This guy here, the core rules are weighing in at like 15, 16 pages. So the rulebook has an example play, which is really useful to work through, so that you can kind of see, not necessarily how the rules work, but how to make the most of the rules to be effective as the Germans. The learning curve for playing the Germans in here, I think, is probably a little bit harder, a little more challenging than for the Soviets. For the Soviets, it's fairly obvious what you got to do. For the Germans, you have to be skillful with your blitzkrieg tactics in order to be successful. I wrote an article to that effect in C3I, but I do not remember which issue is in, but it was back in 2009, 2010 when that was published. So there you go. Caucasus Campaign. If you can find it, grab it. It's different enough from the ZOC-Bond series. I think you'll enjoy it. Doesn't take up a lot of table space. Moves along pretty fast. Got nice big hexes, nice big pieces, and it's a really interesting situation.